some passages in the Torah that do escape occasionally my notice, even after however many years it's been since I started training for the rabbinate. And when you come across them, they then give you a little surprise. And what you realize is that they throw a rather different light on what you thought was a familiar narrative. Earlier on this week, as I was selecting the Torah reading for tomorrow morning, I came across the juxtaposition of a series of verses that I'd never noticed before and made me wonder about their significance. Shemini, the third Sedra in the book of Leviticus, continues with the prescribed ritual sacrifices that we've been reading about over these past 2 weeks. But the context is very different. These are not the daily, regular sacrificial offerings in the tabernacle, but sacrifices connected to the ordination of the priests, Aaron and his 4 sons. These take place, the whole ordination ceremony with all its rituals surrounding it, including the sacrifices, they take place during a 7-day ceremony that ends with this very dramatic, moving scene of Aaron and Moses lifting up their hands, probably like this, towards the people and blessing them. And the text then goes on to describe what happens at that very moment. And it says, "And the presence of the Eternal One appeared to all the people. Vateitzei eish milifnei Adonai, vatochal al hamizbeach et ha'olah ve'et ha'chalavim." Fire came forth from before the Eternal One and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts of the altar. And all the people saw and shouted and fell on their faces. I want you to hold on to that phrase, Vateitzei eish, that fire came forth from the Eternal One. So it seems to me this is the climax of the ordination of Aaron and his sons, all priests. The ordination service has lasted a whole week, beginning with the priest's purification with water, being dressed by Moses in their richly decorated vestments, the ceremony of anointing the tabernacle with oil, all its utensils, the altar, and then pouring oil on Aaron's head. So far, so good. It isn't difficult for us here in the UK to imagine the gravitas and high ritual of the ordination, very similar to the coronation of a king. Less easy to imagine are the sacrificial animals, 1 huge animal and 2 medium-sized, a bull and 2 rams, slaughtered, we assume, in the precincts of the sanctuary, and then this bizarre ritual of smearing some of the second ram's blood on Aaron's right ear, on his right thumb, and on the big toe of his right foot. It's as though Moses is sort of circulating Aaron's whole body from top to toe in an act in which the priest becomes consecrated to God and also to his specific role of ministering to the people. But what about Aaron's 4 sons? Where are they? The fledgling priests in this great drama. They're certainly present. They too are washed. They're dressed in their special garments. They too lay their hands on the head of the bull about to be sacrificed. This younger generation, 4 young men, probably scarcely out of their 20s, must be watching the disemboweling of the animals, inhaling all the smells of the sanctuary as the flesh and innards of the animals are smoked on the altar. And they too undergo the strange ritual of being blooded by the second ram's blood onto their extremities. And the sons and their father are required to remain at the entrance of the tent of meeting day and night for 7 days, keeping God's charge, lest they die. If, in a broad sense, these verses sound somewhat evocative to you, it's because they echo the 7 days of creation and God's charge to the man not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, lest he die. Now, the Talmud, interestingly, connects these two stories, the narrative of creation and the joy of the 8th day, by investing the opening words of this week's parashah, very innocuous word, Vayehi, which simply means "and it was," with the refrain in Genesis 1, Vayehi erev, Vayehi voker, and it was evening and it was morning, day 1, day 2, so on. On that day, says the Talmud, there was joy in the presence of the Holy One, the same joy that existed on the day on which the heavens and the earth were created. So we understand that something consummate is taking place for the priests. This perfect, unalloyed joy in the presence of God that affects not only Moses and Aaron's 4 sons, but the whole people who see the fire coming forth from God, who shout with joy, fall on their faces, utterly overwhelmed by its appearance. But in the same passage in the Talmud that connects the joy of creation with the joy of the ordination ceremony, there is too a very different interpretation of this word, Vayehi. As the Talmud says, Kol makom shene'emar Vayehi, eino ela lashon sa'ar. Wherever the word Vayehi is stated, it is a term that indicates none other than impending grief. And the Talmud quotes from a number of biblical sources where this term is used ominously: the book of Esther, the story of Noah, the book of Ruth, to name but a few. So what was the grief that followed the 7-day ceremony of ordination? On that very day, on the 8th day, 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each takes his own fire pan, lays incense on it, and offers what the Bible calls Eish Zara, strange fire or alien fire, which has not been commanded by God. And exactly the same phrase describing the fire that's come forth from God to consume the sacrifice is used to describe the fire that then goes on to consume the 2 young men. Vatetse ish milifnei Adonai. And the fire came forth from the Eternal One. But this time it's not the sacrifices that are consumed, but the 2 sons of Aaron, whose death leaves Aaron numb with grief. Vayidom Aharon. The fire of God's presence here ends not with the overwhelming shouting and joy of the people, but with Aaron's silence. Vayidom Aharon. And Aaron was silent. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, in her superb commentary to this story, and quoting Rashi's grandson, Rashbam, sees the divine fire that consumes the sacrifices as identical with the one that consumes Aaron's sons. She says, in a single economical gesture, one fire signifies acceptance and forgiveness on the one hand, and destruction on the other. which means that the order of the narrative must be read differently. The two sons having already died in God's presence, even before the conclusion of the whole ordination ceremony. In the midst of the precise execution of the ordination rituals, something has gone wrong. There's a dysfunction that ends with tragedy. There's so much more one can say about this story and the very different rabbinic interpretations as to why these two priests died. But perhaps I can just end by abstracting from the midrashic reading an interpretation that sees the dysfunction not in ritual terms, the offering up of strange fire, but in moral terms. What happens when life and death issues of morality go wrong? What happens when we assume too much power, when authority becomes overbearing? What happens when we fail to acknowledge wrongdoing and shame, failure and responsibility for when things do go wrong? The Talmud's two-way interpretation, the linking of this little word, vayehi, and it was, with episodes of joy as well as ominously with times of grief, reveals the precariousness of our moral choices and their consequences for human life.